Thank you to all of you for joining me here tonight. When I first attended university lectures as a student, I never imagined that I would be stood here now giving an inaugural lecture. And I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the support of family, friends and colleagues, both locally and across the globe. So thank you. So how did I get here? Why am I saying the personal is still political? What does this mean for the future of feminist theology and trans inclusion? The slogan, "The personal is political," has been widely attributed to Carol Hanisch and the 1970s women's liberation movement. Hanisch never used that exact phrase, but it is an apt expression of her argument. In essence, the slogan is intended to challenge the division between the private and the public that blames individual women for their oppression in the home and in the workplace. The slogan draws attention to the religious and metaphysical explanations that are used to justify male dominance, and thus asserts both that the oppression of women on the basis of sex, race, and class is real, and that the solution, equality, requires political, not just personal, change. When I embarked on my academic journey in the early 90s, terrifyingly, I don't think some of my younger colleagues were even born then, I wasn't yet aware of this slogan, but my experiences were in keeping with its meaning. This is me in the student paper at Aberdeen University in 91 or 92. Like other women and girls, I experienced regular sexual harassment. And when I started university, female students were given rape alarms alongside sachets of instant coffee in their welcome packs. The message was clearly that sexual assault was to be expected. In addition, I soon discovered that the reading lists for my degree subject were male-dominated. And throughout my degree, the vast majority of compulsory and guest lectures on my course were given by men. At that point, I had no intention of remaining in academia after graduation. I didn't think of it as a realistic possibility. My primary intention was to be an independent adult, and getting to university seemed to be the quickest way to make that happen. I had chosen to study theology, or divinity as it's called in Scottish universities, because as a naive and idealistic 18-year-old, I wanted to be a more inspiring RE teacher than the ones I'd encountered at school. I strongly believed, and still do, that the study of religion is as important as the study of, for example, geography, history, or literature, for understanding other people's beliefs and practices, and for developing empathy and acceptance of difference. Towards the end of my degree, whilst volunteering in a high school with a damning inspection report, I found myself encircled by a group of domineering 16-year-old lads, all a foot taller than me, and I realised I needed to rethink my intention to be a teacher. Coincidentally, around the same time, one of my lecturers, Professor David Ferguson, suggested I apply for a PhD studentship. I thought he was joking. Surely people with doctorates were geniuses, and I wasn't one of those. As it turned out, it wasn't necessary to be a genius, and he was serious. I certainly wouldn't be here now if it wasn't for his encouragement then. As a postgraduate, I was surrounded by mostly American and South Korean students who held fairly conservative religious beliefs. They were all married men with wives looking after their children, doing their washing and providing their meals. Partway through my studies, I had to cut short an archival trip overseas to escape persistent harassment from a senior academic. Nevertheless, by the time I completed my doctoral study on John McMurray's religious philosophy, I was convinced of several principles that have informed my research ever since. In opposition to the well-known and individualistic Cartesian statements, I think, therefore I am, McMurray argues that personhood is bound up with agency and relationality, stating both I do, therefore I am, and I exist as one element of you and I. In other words, we do not grow up to become independent adults, but to become interdependent persons. Furthermore, as interdependent persons, we can humanize or dehumanize our fellow human beings through our interactions with them. Consequently, developing empathy is of primary importance. Thus, McMurray critiques our educational system for focusing on the intellect at the expense of the emotions. He argues for the promotion of emotional maturity. This is now often referred to as emotional intelligence. But the notion of educating the emotions has ancient roots in Aristotelian philosophy. In respect of religion, McMurray opposes the exclusivity that is bound up with creedal and doctrinal division, instead defining faith as an attitude of trust, and attitude of inclusivity that is inclined towards creating and sustaining community. I took these ideas forward into my work in feminist theology and ethics. I didn't immediately refer to myself as a feminist theologian, however. Despite valuing feminist theology, I was attempting to resist being sidelined into a field that was considered peripheral to mainstream theological concerns. My doctoral work on John McMurray is philosophical theology, somewhere between philosophy of religion and systematic theology. But I needed to pay the rent. So when a lectureship was advertised in gender, religion, and ethics, I wasn't going to ignore it. I should say this was not the first job I applied for, nor was it the first interview I attended. There were some disastrous encounters along the way, from which I learned a great deal. My first interview for an academic post was at a prestigious university in Scotland. All the other candidates were men, and every single candidate, except me, gave a presentation on the highly influential Swiss theologian Karl Barth. I'd recently given birth to a child who rarely slept, and I was up at 4 a.m. to catch the train. So I spent the day drinking copious amounts of black coffee to stay awake. And by the time I went in for my interview, which was with the whole faculty, not just a couple of members of staff, I had the shakes and could barely answer a question. Anyway, after a few temporary posts, I was interviewed for the Gender, Religion and Ethics lectureship as a job share with someone who was to become not just a great colleague, but also a close friend. We were offered and accepted the job. But even that interview was not without intrigue. One of the other interviewees was a well-established scholar, someone the rest of us had studied. We couldn't wait to tell everyone the name of the person we'd been interviewed alongside. A couple of days later, we received an email stating that this particular scholar didn't want anyone to know they'd been interviewed for the post. I'm afraid that email came too late. Once in post, my first experience of teaching feminist theology and ethics revealed something of a disjunction between my perspective and that of my students. The mostly white middle-class students told me they were post-feminist. The Spice Girls had topped the charts with girl power. Surely women had equality now. They didn't need feminism anymore. And there I was, stood at the lectern, knowing that I would have to leave a departmental meeting early that afternoon to collect my daughter from the campus nursery that shut before the meeting ended. I'd made inquiries about changing the time of the meeting and been told it's always been at this time. And at the end of the month, my entire income would be exactly the same amount as the bills for the monthly nursery fees and rent of a small damp back-to-back, with none left over for utility bills or food. If I had been a single parent, it would have been impossible for me to go to work, and that was on an academic salary. My experiences of giving conference papers and developing my research profile were equally ambiguous. The professor assigned to me as a mentor advised me not to publish anything with feminist in the title if I wanted my career to progress. Well, I decided I was more interested in publishing on feminist issues than on speedy progression. And my next two publications were feminist critiques of theological concepts. In the first paper, contrary to patriarchal and androcentric God language, I explored gender transcendent possibilities. I argued that traditional God language implies erroneously that God is necessarily male and stereotypically masculine. Furthermore, the construction of a male God legitimizes the suppression of women as inferior to men. Since all God talk is metaphorical, however, we can revise those metaphors, and moreover, equality for women in the Christian religion requires that we do so. The concept of God needs to be freed from the patriarchal language and culture that imagine the divine as male. I borrowed from McMurray the notion of God as supreme agent, as one option for retaining a sense of personhood and otherness, but without gender. As I ended a presentation of this paper at a large theology conference, a male professor pointed his finger at me and shouted angrily that I had ruined his life. I had never met him before and was at a loss as to how to respond. When I returned to that particular annual theology conference, I questioned why I was doing this to myself. Other female theologians told me they were staying away, but I protested, if we stay away, it will never change. If we keep going, we can break it down from the inside. However, I soon discovered how difficult that would be, as I witnessed a whole new generation of postgraduate students emulating their supervisors, believing that publications and academic appointments would be found by becoming experts in the same narrow range of white male scholarship. Hence, Black and feminist theologies remained marginal, and I realised that Audre Lorde was right. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And this fact is only threatening to those women who still define the master's house as their only source of support. In my next paper, I argued that the concept of sacrifice prevented Christian churches from responding adequately to domestic abuse. I began the paper with a Home Office report on domestic violence and recent cases of FIFA not taking any action against footballers seen acting violently towards their female partners. Now, more than 15 years later, domestic abuse has increased during the coronavirus pandemic lockdown, and football clubs have yet again rewarded players who've committed sexual assault. In particular, I was critiquing the Church of England's guidelines on responding to domestic abuse. Positively, the C of E guidelines noted that it had failed to challenge abusers, and further, that masculine imagery to characterize God had validated overbearing and violent patterns of behavior, while a theology of humility had often been misapplied to women. Nevertheless, it did not go far enough, since it required only careful interpretation of male God language, and it still maintained that genuine self-denial is a gateway to abundant life and a means of bringing good out of evil. Sacrifice and suffering associated with sacrifice is a central theme in the Christian religion, but it is a dangerous motif. The language of sacrifice serves to legitimize the power of the dominant class and encourages the subordinate class to sacrifice themselves to that power out of duty to their religion. This is now being referred to as a form of spiritual abuse, coercive and controlling behavior using scripture or God as justification. As a solution, I argued that for oppressed groups, self-love is required, an adequate conception of self-worth that leads to flourishing. This presentation was well received, and an editor of a well-known journal suggested I submit the paper for publication. The referees disagreed on the grounds that I wasn't citing the usual suspects. I saw this as a strength rather than a flaw. Nevertheless, it took a few attempts for this article to find a publisher, and I wondered if my mentor was right about the use of the term feminist in academic work. By this time, we'd had our second child. We'd waited until our first started school so that we'd only be paying one set of nursery fees at a time. How parents with twins manage, I do not know. When our eldest told her classmates that we were expecting a baby, they sent us a list of potential baby names. Jesus, Cinderella, or Santa. Returning to work after maternity leave, which was only 4 months back then, I found that I could no longer brush off the sexist bullying, which was getting worse. I was exhausted, trying to stay on top of my job and find time and space at work to express milk and run it up to the nursery. It was then that I saw a job advertised at York St John University. The truth is, at this time, it wasn't an institution I knew very much about, but it was a commutable distance from our home in Leeds, and that seemed promising. Anyone I mentioned it to in academic circles, however, tried to talk me out of applying. They told me it would be a backward step. I'd be traveling more, I'd be paid less, I'd be at a less prestigious institution. Already disillusioned by historical hierarchies and their exclusionary practices, I again ignored the advice and applied for the job. I was invited to an interview, which was appropriately rigorous, and yet there was something about the friendly and supportive atmosphere of this place that was almost tangible. Not only that, I was impressed by the university's commitment to social justice and to students from diverse socio-economic backgrounds. So I came to work at YSJ. It doesn't seem that long ago, so I was shocked to receive a long service recognition recently. Apparently I've been here for 15 years. My first role here was working with Professor Sebastian Kim in the burgeoning field of public theology. The aim of public theology is to interact with contemporary issues in society by engaging with other academic fields, such as politics, economics, and cultural studies, seeking a fairer society for all. On the one hand, public theology appeared to be a diverse field. It was taking global representation seriously and was intentionally inclusive of members and perspectives from the global south. On the other hand, the racial diversity was not matched by gender diversity amongst its members. Moreover, as an increasing number of centres for public theology sprang up across the globe over the next few years, they were named after and mostly directed by white men. Likewise, the growing corpus of publications in the field consistently cited the same collection of male scholars. To challenge this reproduction of male hegemony, I guest edited a special issue of the International Journal of Public Theology entitled Hearing the Other, deliberately focusing on the inclusion of the perspectives of women and minority groups. Despite several public theologians acknowledging the validity of my critique and the importance of hearing the voices of the marginalised, their 2016 triennial conference had an all-male lineup of keynote speakers. There were many female scholars at the conference, and when I questioned the organising committee on their choice of speakers, they replied that they had asked a woman, but she had been unable to attend. A woman? As if there is only one woman in the whole field? It's an excuse I've heard at other conferences too. As if one invitation is an adequate response to underrepresentation. Diversity and inclusion requires so much more than this. Public theology has taken steps towards increasing gender diversity since then. But as many female academics know, constantly calling out underrepresentation and sexism is exhausting. Thus, when Sara Ahmed published Living a Feminist Life, she renewed our resolve by articulating what so many of us were experiencing. Citation practices are political acts. Feeling like we don't fit in is deliberate. The system was designed to make us feel like outsiders. Calling out a problem turns the focus on you, and you become the problem. That eye roll that we get so used to seeing when we speak up is feminist pedagogy. Critiquing sexism means being a feminist killjoy. It was then a highlight of my work here when I was able to bring Sara Ahmed to York St John for International Women's Day. The event had been 2 years in the planning. As it drew near, talk of some new virus spreading across the world raised doubts as to whether it would go ahead. As it turned out, Sara's visit to YSJ would be her last public speaking event before the first coronavirus lockdown in March 2020. Progress is frequently met with backlash, however. Alongside diversification in public theology, another branch of the field has arisen with a regressive agenda. In 2015, a $2 million grant was awarded to a 3-year project developing analytic theology. At the end of that period, the 2018 conference, entitled The Futures of Analytic Theology, consisted of papers by 5 white men. When I question the appropriateness of only hearing from white men, or when I hear a paper in which all the citations are to work by white men, the question returned to me is this: but what does it matter who the speakers are or who they've cited, if the argument is a good one? My response is this: but it's not a good argument if it's based on a limited and partial perspective. It's only hearing one side of the story, only engaging in half a conversation. We need to ask whose voices are missing. A few years ago, a Nigerian developer, Emeka Afigbo, went viral when he illustrated the problems that can arise if your workforce is not diverse. He posted a video clip of two men, one white, one black, at the sinks in the bathroom. The white man puts his hand under the soap dispenser and out comes the soap. The black man puts his hand under the dispenser and nothing happens. Maybe the dispenser is empty. But then the black man takes a white tissue and places that on his hand. And this time, the soap is dispensed. What are we missing if we only consider a narrow range of perspectives? What flaws are we designing into the system? What exclusionary practices are we maintaining? Analytic theology ignores decades of Black and feminist theologies. It claims to be applying a philosophical analytic method to matters of theological concern so as to ascertain the truth. In so doing, however, it fails to challenge power relations in epistemology. It fails to recognize or critique the workings of privilege in its own arguments. When the questions with which analytic theology is concerned are approached from, for example, a feminist perspective, the questions are framed differently and different answers emerge. I'll illustrate this further by briefly considering the problem of evil. As any of you who have studied philosophy of religion at A-level or at university will know, the existence of evil, pain and death caused by famine, earthquakes, diseases, and moral evil, the suffering that human beings inflict on one another, is presented as a challenge to belief in the existence of an all-powerful, all-loving God. Attempts to resolve this problem are known as theodicies, analytic arguments that aim to demonstrate the logical compatibility of God and evil. Frequently, these arguments rely on the notion of human free will. This analytic approach gives the impression of objectivity, and yet throughout the history of Christianity, women have been portrayed as more evil than men, and Black women in particular have been subjugated. From the perspective of womanist scholars, African-American women, rather than asking whether the existence of God and evil are compatible, the question, in Jacqueline Grant's words, is, why does God permit the suffering of Black women? Or even more pointedly, does God condone the fact that Black women are systematically relegated to being servants of servants? From a Latina perspective, reflecting on the lives of impoverished women in Brazil, Ivona Gabara states that theology has always given preference to evil as men perceive it, with no reference to the evil actually borne by women. Evil as women know it has been reduced to silence. And so, I argue, to properly address the problem of evil, social, economic, and political inequalities need to be considered. Those with privilege need to centre the voices of the marginalised. There is then much work still to be done. We have a greater understanding of intersectionality, the multiple oppressions based on race, sex, class, sexuality, disability, and gender. I have no doubt that, despite the sexism I have encountered, I have benefited from privilege. I'm white, cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied. How much harder my journey would have been if I'd been Black, trans, disabled, gay, or bi. We have seen the toppling of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol and the Colston Four acquitted. But the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, proposed forgiving the trespasses of people immortalised in the form of statues rather than tearing them down. There is still a gender and racial promotion and pay gap in academia. The Higher Education Statistics Agency data for 2019 to 20 noted that only 28% of professors were female and only 2% of UK professors were Black women. The Church of England appointed its first Black female bishop, Rose Hudson Wilkin, in 2019, but still allows parishes to refuse to accept a woman priest. The Church ordains gay men, but they must be celibate. The Church ordains transgender priests, but many of its leaders have written to the government opposing the proposed ban on conversion therapy. Whilst announcing that the Church must welcome LGBTQ+ folk, the Church has yet to accept same-sex marriage. The personal is still political. While the Me Too hashtag exposed the prevalence of sexual harassment in the workplace, a parallel hashtag, Church2, revealed the extent of sexual abuse and victim blaming taking place within Christian communities. The theology that supports female subordination has not gone away. Abused women are still told that self-sacrifice is their Christian duty, and they should pray for and forgive their abusers. Institutions close ranks to protect the reputations of perpetrators. And this still happens in academia too. Prestigious universities have appointed and rewarded male academics who have a history of sexual harassment and assault. Their careers have progressed while their victims' lives and educational opportunities are destroyed. There is a spurious line of arguments that claims it would be anti-philosophical not to continue to study works by these scholars. Apparently, actions in their private lives have no bearing on the quality of their arguments. This attempt to separate private and public is only possible from a position of privilege, and it fundamentally ignores the suffering of the abused. The personal is still political. My students now are keenly aware of the so-called culture wars. They are sometimes wary of calling themselves feminists in case this gives the impression that they are transphobes. This caution is the result of the media focus on so-called gender-critical feminists. Under the banner of freedom of speech, self-named gender-critical feminists claim that trans women's rights are incompatible with cis women's rights. There are several problems with this claim. I'll just mention three. First, while claiming to be gender critical, they are in fact gender conservative and prepared to judge women based on the extent to which their appearance is feminine. This is a backward step in the feminist effort to counter the requirements of femininity. Secondly, while claiming to be defending women's rights to single-sex spaces, gender-critical feminists have aligned themselves with right-wing groups in the US and the UK that oppose, for example, access to abortion. This is also a backward step in the feminist effort to increase bodily autonomy and choices. Thirdly, while claiming that their freedom to express gender-critical views is being suppressed, they express themselves on major media platforms. In reality, it is the voices of trans men and women that are rarely heard in these spaces. So I want to make it clear that feminism and trans rights are not incompatible. On the contrary, feminism aims at equality, and we cannot consistently fight for the equality of one marginalised group whilst continuing the oppression of another group. In a patriarchal society, power is held by cishet, white, middle-class, able-bodied men. Driving a wedge between feminists and trans folk only serves to maintain patriarchal power and privilege. We need solidarity amongst all marginalised groups, and we need men as allies. Men in heteropatriarchal society and religion are confined to a narrow definition of manhood, sometimes called the man box, which promotes male violence and curtails emotion and creativity. Feminism envisions a fairer future for men as well as women, whether cis or transgender. In Sara Ahmed's words, solidarity does not assume that our struggles are the same struggles, or that our pain is the same pain. Solidarity involves commitment and work. In that vein, Dr. Sharon Jagger and I have been working on a 2-year project with financial assistance from the Church Universities Fund, aimed at hearing and centering the voices of trans and non-binary folk. Against a backdrop of ambiguity and discrimination towards LGBTQ+ folk in the Church, we sought to debunk the myth that theology is necessarily homo and transphobic. Based on questionnaires and interviews, we give recommendations for improving inclusion. As you can see from the screen, our participants have given these positive endorsement. The report, with original illustrations by trans artist Fox Fisher, is open access, free to download at this link on the screen. Or you can collect a print copy outside here. The socially just future requires that we root out all forms of discrimination. The Church must relinquish religious exemptions from equality laws, and feminist theology must be trans inclusive. Thank you for listening.